Why did the laughter sting more than any punch could? Leo Reed sat frozen at his desk, staring at a single jagged scratch in the wood grain. If he focused hard enough, maybe he could disappear into it, slip into the dark line and hide there. His ears burned red, his throat ached with words he couldn't say. Around him, the classroom roared with laughter, sharp, cruel, teenage laughter that rolled like a wave and crashed directly onto him. He hadn't expected to be singled out. He hadn't expected his mother's name to become a weapon. A Navy SEAL, your mother, Leo, that's the most absurd thing I've heard all year. Mr. Harrison, his history teacher, leaned against the blackboard with that smug, knowing smile. His chalk tapped against the board like a gavel. Are you sure she wasn't just a cook on some base somewhere? Maybe folded laundry for the real soldiers. The laughter erupted again, louder, more confident this time. Each laugh was another stone against Leo's chest. He clenched his fists under the desk, nails digging into his palms until the sting replaced the heat behind his eyes. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell them about the scars on her hands, about how she could move through their backyard like a shadow no one saw until she wanted to. He wanted to tell them about the way she stood still when others shook, or how she never raised her voice because she didn't need to. But his throat closed. His words stayed buried. Mr. Harrison paced, enjoying his stage. Let be realistic, class. The Navy SEALs are the pinnacle of masculine strength, the best of the best. Men who can run 100 miles, swim through frozen oceans, survive things that would break normal people. Men of grit, iron, unshakable will. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the room, then letting it settle back on Leo like a spotlight. It is not a place for someone's quiet suburban mom, a woman who probably spends her days gardening. The laughter hit its cruelest pitch. Some students slapped their desks. One mimicked digging in soil, another pretended to water flowers. Leo's stomach knotted until he thought he might be sick. He kept his eyes on the scratch in the desk, refusing to lift his head. But in his mind he saw her face. Calm, precise, unreadable. He saw her tending to the garden she actually did keep, yes, but with movements that were efficient, almost military. He saw the way she watched the horizon sometimes as if she were waiting for something no one else could see. He saw her scars, the ones he wasn't supposed to ask about. And he knew Mr. Harrison was wrong. Not just wrong, insulting. The final bell shrieked, slicing through the noise. Books closed, chairs scraped, students rushed for the door. But the poison lingered. The words clung to Leo like smoke. He walked home alone, shoulders tight, the silence of the neighborhood pressing in on him. By the time he pushed through the front door, the weight was unbearable. The dam broke. Words spilled out, fragments of shame, anger, frustration tumbling over one another. His voice cracked, his chest heaved. He told her everything. Evelyn Reed stood at the kitchen counter, a cloth in hand. She didn't turn immediately. She didn't interrupt. She listened, every detail, every wound, every cruel laugh. Her posture was perfect, her movements calm. She wiped the counter again, though it was already spotless. When he finished, the silence was heavy. He searched her face for anger, for outrage, for something to match the storm inside him. But her expression was unreadable, a mask of profound calm. She folded the cloth with deliberate care, aligning the edges until they matched perfectly. Then she placed it on the counter, hands steady, eyes steady. "Understood," she said. One word, nothing more. It carried the weight of 1,000 promises. Leo blinked, uncertain. "That's it, Mom, he humiliated me. He humiliated you." But Evelyn was already moving. She walked down the hall to the room Leo was rarely allowed to enter, her office. The door stood ajar, and curiosity pulled him after her. Inside, the air felt heavier, older. Shelves lined with books, locked drawers, and on the desk, a secure satellite phone, a relic of something past but never gone. She picked it up like she'd used it yesterday, not years ago. Her fingers dialed from memory. Leo leaned in the doorway, heart hammering. Her voice when she spoke was low, calm, without a flicker of hesitation. "This is Echo. requesting a courtesy muster, affirmative, Northgate High School, 800 tomorrow, full dress. She ended the call. No explanations, no dramatic pause, just efficient precision. Then she looked at him. For the first time since he had spilled his shame, something flickered in her eyes. Not a smile, but a depth of assurance. Something unshakable. Get some rest, Leo. The truth has a way of making itself known. That night Leo lay awake staring at the ceiling. He replayed the laughter, the jeers, Mr. Harrison's smirk. But those echoes warred against something else now, the sound of her voice. Calm, commanding. Yako. The word stuck in his mind like a mystery unsolved. He had never heard her call herself that. He didn't know what it meant. But he felt the weight of it, the way the air seemed to change when she said it. And for the first time since the humiliation in class, Leo felt something different than shame. He felt anticipation. The next morning, Northgate High buzzed as usual. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked across tile floors, voices filled the halls. In the faculty lounge, Mr. Harrison retold the story to his colleagues, milking it for every laugh he could. "Can you believe it?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "The poor boy actually thinks his mother was a SEAL, a suburban mom. Maybe she commanded the PTA. Maybe she led the neighborhood watch. But a Navy SEAL, please." His colleagues laughed politely, though one or two shifted uncomfortably. His voice carried, as it always did. Harrison believed authority lived in volume. But then the sound began. Subtle at first, a hum, a vibration in the soles of shoes. Students glanced at the floor, confused. Teachers paused mid-sentence. The hum grew, into a rhythm, into a beat. Hundreds of synchronized steps, striking asphalt in unison. The sound of discipline, the sound of purpose. Chatter faded. Heads turned toward the quad. Curtains twitched as students leaned against windows. Teachers drifted outside, brows furrowed. And then they saw it. A river of navy blue and white uniforms flowing onto campus with impossible precision. 200 men, every line straight, every movement unified. Marching in silence, in formation, their presence heavy as iron. They filled the quad, formed a block of humanity so sharp it looked carved from stone. And then, as one, they stopped. Silence absolute, crushing. The school froze. 1,000 eyes stared. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Harrison stepped out of the lounge, coffee cup in hand. He frowned, annoyed at the disruption. What in the world? It had to be a prank, a senior stunt, some absurd show. But his words caught in his throat when he saw how still they stood. Not a laugh, not a whisper, not a breath wasted. 200 men, frozen in perfect unison, their gaze fixed forward. And then she arrived. Not in a military convoy, not in a government sedan. Evelyn Reed pulled into the visitor's lot in her old station wagon. She stepped out in jeans, a plain gray sweater, practical boots. She carried nothing. No medals, no rank, nothing remarkable. And yet, as she walked across the campus lawn, the formation shifted. Not with commands, not with orders. A path opened through them, instinctive, silent. Respect cleared the way. Every eye followed her. And Leo, watching from the window of his classroom, felt his chest swell with something fierce and undeniable. The truth was coming. And it was louder than any laugh. What kind of power makes 200 warriors fall silent? On the lawn of Northgate High, the formation stood unbroken, a wall of men in immaculate uniforms. The air pulsed with quiet tension, the kind of silence that pressed against eardrums harder than any noise. Even the birds seemed to hold back, unwilling to cut across the discipline below. Evelyn Reed walked into it without hesitation. No swagger, no performance, just steady steps, boots tapping softly against the pavement as she moved through the parted ranks. She didn't glance at them, didn't need to. Their eyes tracked her with a reverence that was almost unbearable to watch. Leo could barely breathe at the window. His heart thundered in his chest, a rhythm against the glass. He wanted to scream at his classmates, "That's my mom. Do you see now? Do you understand?" But the words never left his lips. The students around him were already whispering, "Who is she? Why are they here? What's going on?" Mr. Harrison shoved his way through the gathering crowd, voice climbing, anger boiling. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am." He waved his free hand, coffee sloshing dangerously in the other. "This is an unauthorized assembly. You are disrupting the educational environment." Evelyn didn't even turn her head. Her eyes stayed forward, locked on the men who had carved a corridor just for her. Mr. Harrison's face flushed red. His voice grew shrill, echoing off the brick walls of the school. "You can't just walk in here with this circus. I demand you stop immediately. This is unacceptable." But his words fell into the silence like stones into the ocean. They vanished, meaningless. On the porch steps, Principal Miller appeared. He was an older man, his shoulders squared even in retirement, the lines on his face carrying more authority than Harrison's bluster ever could. Miller's eyes scanned the quad, narrowing as he took in the details no one else could see. The golden tridents, the subdued patches, the ribbons, the faces. Recognition flickered across him. Not shock, not confusion, something deeper, understanding. He had seen fragments of these men before, in classified briefings, in grainy black and white photos, whispers in secure rooms, legends no one admitted were real. And then his eyes fell on Evelyn, the way she stood, relaxed but unshakable, parade rest without even thinking about it. Her presence shifted the air. Principal Miller's chest tightened. He knew what he was looking at. Meanwhile, Leo pressed closer to the glass, hardly able to contain the storm inside him. The classmates who mocked him yesterday now stood frozen, some pale, some with mouths hanging open, their laughter gutted out of them. And Leo, for the first time, felt taller. Mr. Harrison didn't notice. He was still shouting, "I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect. Whoever you are, I suggest you take your theatrics in." "Mr. Harrison." The voice cut through the air like a blade, calm, firm, absolute. Principal Miller had descended the steps and now stood in front of him, one hand resting on the teacher's shoulder. His expression was sharp, his tone final. "I suggest you stop talking, now." For a moment Harrison looked like he might argue, but the weight in Miller's eyes broke him. He froze mid-sentence, lips parting but no sound escaping. His authority crumbled in silence. Miller turned to the crowd. His voice carried across the quad, steady and commanding without need for a microphone. "For 20 years, I served in the United States Army. I worked alongside operators from every branch in every shadow of the world. We like to tell ourselves we understand what that means. We don't." He gestured toward the formation. "Look closely. These men, they are not here for spectacle. They are not props in a high school drama. They are history standing before you." Students shifted, murmurs rippling. Miller's hand lifted again, pointing toward the third rank. "That man is Senior Chief Marcus Thorne. He held off an enemy force of 50 men alone for 6 hours, protecting his wounded teammates. Navy Cross recipient." Gasps, heads turned, eyes wide. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander James "Reaper" Gallo. His team conducted the highest altitude halo jump in combat history. The whispers grew louder, awe spreading like wildfire. And there, Master Chief David Chun, one of the most decorated combat medics in the history of naval special warfare. Silence fell again, a silence thick with realization. Then Miller's gaze shifted, not to the men, but to Evelyn. He let the weight of the moment settle before speaking again. "But there is something more, something you don't see yet." He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the screen, and connected it to the school's outdoor projector. A single image filled the wall of the gym, a heavily redacted military citation. Lines of black obscured names and locations, but one word remained clear. "Echo." The crowd leaned in, reading the lines aloud in hushed voices, descriptions of impossible odds, a lone operator holding ground against overwhelming forces, saving lives when failure was certain, words like bravery, sacrifice, honor. This, Miller said, his voice tightening, is the Medal of Honor citation awarded to the commander of this unit, known only by the code name Echo. He paused, letting it sink in. The projector's glow lit Evelyn's face, calm as ever, unflinching. Then Miller turned to the students, the teachers, the entire frozen audience. His voice dropped, heavy as stone. Her name is Evelyn Reed. It was like air being sucked out of the world. Gasps, wide eyes, disbelief. Every head turned, to the gray sweater, to the quiet mother, to the woman who had walked through their hallways unnoticed, her son mocked in her shadow. Leo's throat closed, tears stinging his eyes, not from shame this time, from vindication, from pride so fierce it almost hurt. Mr. Harrison staggered back, his coffee spilling across the pavement. His mouth opened, then shut again. His face drained to the color of chalk. Every brick of arrogance he had built collapsed in an instant. And then, as if one thought passed silently through 200 men, the formation moved. Right arms snapped upward in perfect unison. The salute cracked like thunder, not for the crowd, not for Miller, not for Northgate High. For her. For Echo. Evelyn Reed did not salute back. She simply gave the smallest nod, almost invisible, almost nothing. But to them it was everything. 200 arms held steady, locked like steel. 200 gazes fixed on their commander. The silence became electric, a living thing that made the students' skin prickle. Leo pressed a hand against the window, chest heaving. He wanted to shout, to cry, to laugh, but the words caught. All he could do was watch his mother, quiet, unremarkable, extraordinary, stand in front of legends who treated her as their equal, their leader, their anchor. And for the first time in his life, he saw her not as just his mother, but as something vast, something untouchable. The woman who had said nothing last night had spoken louder than anyone ever could. Not with her mouth. With silence. Why did silence feel heavier than any scream? On the quad, 200 salutes held like iron. Evelyn Reed gave her nod, the smallest acknowledgement, and the moment stretched into eternity. The air was thick, almost trembling, as if the entire school stood inside a sealed vault. Even the students, usually restless, didn't dare move. Their sneakers stayed rooted, their whispers trapped in throats. And then, as quickly as it began, the movement ended. The salute dropped in unison. Not sloppy, not staggered, perfect. 200 arms lowering in a single motion so sharp it cracked against the stillness like a whip. No one clapped, no one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was too sacred, too strange, too far outside the boundaries of normal life. Leo finally let out the breath he'd been holding. It came as a shaky exhale, his hand pressed to the glass like he might fall without it. His classmates around him stood in stunned silence. The same kids who had laughed yesterday, who had imitated watering cans and garden gloves, now couldn't even look him in the eye. The bell rang. Its shrill cry seemed almost insulting, like a toy horn blaring in the middle of a funeral. Nobody moved. Principal Miller stepped forward again, his voice calm, steady, cutting through the charged air. "That's enough for now. Dismissed." 2 words, that was all it took. The formation dissolved, not with chaos, not with chatter, but with flawless precision. Lines broke, rows shifted, and in seconds the 200 warriors were gone, flowing off the quad as if the earth had simply swallowed them. The silence lingered in their absence, an afterimage burned into memory. Evelyn Reed turned, her sweater still plain, her boots still practical, her expression unreadable. She walked toward the school entrance with the same unremarkable stride she had carried into the quad. No raised chin, no proud shoulders, just steady. Leo tore himself from the window and bolted into the hallway. His legs carried him faster than he thought possible, dodging stunned students frozen in doorways. When he burst into the open air, his mother was already there, walking away from the quad. He stopped short. Something inside him ached to run to her, to hug her, to shout his pride to the sky. But her pace was unbroken, her posture steady, and he understood without words. Not now. She had given him the truth, but she hadn't done it for applause. Behind him, Mr. Harrison stumbled into the open. His coffee cup was gone, a brown stain spreading across his shirt like a wound. His face was ghost pale, his lips trembling. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Mrs. Commander Reed, I—" Evelyn stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes finally meeting his. The crowd behind them hushed, leaning forward as though about to witness an execution. But her expression didn't shift. No anger, no triumph, no vengeance. "My son told the truth," she said, her voice even, steady, unshakable. "That is all that ever mattered." And with that, she turned again. She placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, grounding him like an anchor. Together, they walked away. The crowd parted like water. No laughter, no jeers, just silence. Mr. Harrison stood alone, his authority shredded, his arrogance hollow. Leo felt taller than he ever had, not because of the eyes on him, not because the whispers had turned to awe, but because his mother's hand was on his shoulder, and he finally understood what that meant. That night, Northgate High hummed with rumors. Social media exploded. Photos of the quad, blurry videos of the march, captions half believing, half in shock. By the time the sun set, the story had spread far beyond the school. In their small home, though, the quiet remained. Leo sat at the kitchen table, his phone buzzing nonstop beside him. He didn't touch it. He watched his mother instead. She sat in her chair, sipping tea, reading the same book she had been working through for weeks. Her face calm, her posture perfect. He finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her eyes lifted from the page, steady on him. "Tell you what?" "That you were Echo." His voice cracked on the word like it was too heavy to hold. "That you did all of that, that you commanded them." She set the book down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table before she answered. "Because it was never about me, Leo." His brow furrowed. "But everyone should know what you did, what you survived." Evelyn shook her head once. "Everyone knowing doesn't change the truth, and the truth doesn't need an audience." Her words landed like stones in his chest. He wanted to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. The scars on her hands caught the kitchen light. He thought of the rifle she cleaned sometimes, not as a hobby, but as ritual. He thought of the silence she carried like armor. And he began to understand. At school the next day, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers trailed him in every hallway, not mocking anymore, curious, awestruck. Some gave him space as if he were radioactive. Others stared openly, struggling to connect the quiet boy they'd laughed at with the mother they now knew was legend. For Leo, it was dizzying. Part of him wanted to shrink back into invisibility. Part of him wanted to walk taller, to throw Harrison's words back in his face. But then he remembered his mother's calm, her words in the kitchen. The truth doesn't need an audience. So he walked steady, silent just like her. Mr. Harrison, meanwhile, was unraveling. His voice in class had lost its volume. His jokes landed flat. When he spoke about military history, his throat tightened, his words stumbled. He couldn't stop seeing Evelyn Reed's calm face. He couldn't unhear the silence of 200 salutes. The weight of his arrogance pressed harder each day. One afternoon, Leo caught him staring out the classroom window long after the bell. His coffee had gone cold. His hand shook slightly where it rested on the desk. Harrison had been broken, yes, but in the cracks something new was forming. The question was whether he could face it. The question was whether he would. What happens to a man when the mirror finally cracks? Mr. Harrison sat alone in his classroom after the last bell, the walls humming faintly with the echoes of departing students. The desks were empty, the chalk dust settled. He stared at the blackboard without seeing it. His coffee cup sat forgotten on the edge of his desk, a brown ring staining the papers beneath. His hand twitched when he reached for it, then stopped midway, fingers curling into a fist. He couldn't stop hearing it. The sound of 200 boots striking pavement in unison. The silence that followed. The salute that cut through everything he thought he knew about power, about authority, about strength. He had mocked her, Evelyn Reed, a woman who had stood in front of legends without needing to raise her voice, without needing to defend herself. She hadn't shouted him down. She hadn't humiliated him in return. She had left him alone, small, drowning in his own words. And that somehow was worse. Harrison rubbed his face, his fingers dragging down his cheeks until they pressed against the hollow beneath his jaw. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known, that anyone would have laughed at such a claim. But the excuses felt like paper shields, useless. In the silence of the room, he whispered aloud, "What have I done?" The words sounded pathetic, but they were the only ones that felt true. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Reed stood at the kitchen sink. Her hands moved with habitual precision, rinsing a plate, drying it, placing it in the cupboard. Every motion efficient, measured. Leo sat at the table, his schoolwork spread before him, though his pencil hadn't moved in minutes. His eyes were fixed on her. "Do you forgive him?" he finally asked. Her hands stilled. She set the towel down, turned, and leaned against the counter. She studied him, her gaze steady. "Who?" "Mr. Harrison," Leo said, his voice caught, frustration leaking into it. "He humiliated me. He humiliated you. He laughed, he made everyone laugh. He doesn't deserve forgiveness." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about what someone deserves," she said at last. "It's about whether you choose to carry their actions with you." Leo frowned, "But he doesn't deserve." She shook her head once gently. "Leo, holding on to his cruelty doesn't punish him, it punishes you. The truth already spoke for itself. That's enough." Leo looked down at his notebook, her words pressing on him like weights. He wanted anger. He wanted revenge. But she was offering something harder, letting go. That night Harrison sat at his desk at home, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He pulled down an old box from the closet, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were photos of himself younger, fresher, wearing the uniform of a reserve officer he had never fully earned the respect of. He had loved the look of the uniform, the way people nodded at him on the street, but deep down, he knew he had never carried the weight men like Evelyn Reed carried. And now he saw himself for what he was, a man who had hidden behind titles, behind volume, behind arrogance. He had mistaken noise for strength. His wife passed by the doorway, pausing when she saw him hunched over the photos. "You okay?" He didn't look up. "No," he said softly, "I've been wrong." She studied him for a moment, then came to rest a hand lightly on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd heard that tone in his voice. Vulnerable, honest. She didn't press. She just let the silence sit. At school the next morning, Harrison's presence felt different. His shoulders slumped, his voice subdued. He no longer barked at students who came in late. He no longer filled the classroom with noise. He spoke carefully, almost haltingly, like a man relearning language. The students noticed. Whispers rippled, not cruel this time, but curious. In the hallway, Leo walked past him. Their eyes met for the first time since the quad. Harrison's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he just gave the slightest nod, small, tentative, unsure. It wasn't enough to erase anything, but it was a beginning. That evening, Principal Miller called Evelyn. His voice was low, respectful. "I thought you should know," he said. "Harrison's different, quieter, he's trying." Evelyn's answer was simple, "Good." "Do you want him punished?" Miller asked. "Formally reprimanded, removed?" Evelyn was silent for a moment. Her eyes drifted toward Leo, sitting in the living room, reading with a calm focus she hadn't seen in him before. "No," she said finally. "The truth punished him enough. What he does now, that's his choice." Miller was quiet on the other end, then exhaled. "You always were better at that than most of us." Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. In the days that followed, Harrison began to change his lessons. Gone were the blustering stories of conquest and masculine bravado. He began speaking about the quiet sacrifices most never saw, the soldier who never told anyone about his nightmares, the medic who carried scars no metal could heal, the families who endured in silence. He spoke of humility, of the weight of truth, of the danger of assumptions. Some students didn't understand. Some mocked him behind his back for the sudden change, but others listened, really listened. And slowly his classroom shifted from a stage of arrogance to a space of reflection. Leo sat in the back, watching. Part of him still burned with memory of humiliation, but another part, a part that sounded like his mother's voice, saw something else. A man trying to rebuild from rubble. One afternoon, Harrison stopped him after class. His hands trembled slightly as he held out a folder. "Leo," he said quietly, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I was wrong. About your mother, about you, about strength." Leo stared at him, unsure what to say. He opened the folder. Inside were drafts of new lesson plans, not about battles won, about lessons learned, about dignity, about silence. At the front, Harrison had written one word, echo. Leo's throat tightened. He closed the folder gently and handed it back. "You don't have to prove it to me," he said. His voice was soft, steady, almost like hers. "Just teach it to them." Harrison blinked, stunned. Then he nodded, his eyes glassy. "I will." That night, Leo told his mother what had happened. She listened quietly, as she always did. Her expression didn't shift, but her eyes softened, just barely. "You handled it well," she said. "I didn't forgive him," Leo admitted. "You don't have to, not yet." She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his. "Forgiveness isn't a performance, it's a choice, and sometimes it takes time." Leo nodded slowly. He thought about the nod she had given the 200 men, small, almost invisible, enough. He wondered if maybe forgiveness would be the same. For now, he was content with silence. What did she see when she closed her eyes at night? Leo asked himself that question more often now. He would glance across the room when she sat in her chair, a book open in her hands, her tea steaming beside her. She looked ordinary, utterly ordinary. But sometimes her eyes would drift away from the page, and he could tell she wasn't reading anymore. She was someplace else. He wanted to ask, he wanted to know. But the rules of their house were unspoken. She would tell him when she was ready. That night, curiosity tugged too hard. "Mom," Leo said softly, "what does echo mean?" Her hand stilled. The book closed without a sound. She placed it on the table, perfectly aligned. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she leaned back, her eyes on him, steady as always. "An echo," she said, "isn't the original sound. It's what lingers, what returns after everything else has faded." Leo tilted his head. "But why you?" Evelyn looked past him, as though through the walls of their home, into memories only she could see. "Because sometimes all that remains is the person who refuses to fall, the one who carries what's left when others can't." Her voice was calm, but her gaze grew heavier, and for a moment Leo felt as though she wasn't speaking to him, but to the ghost she carried. He leaned forward. "What happened back then?" A silence stretched, thick and fragile. Then she exhaled slowly, as though she'd been holding the breath for years. "It was winter, a place far colder than you've ever felt. The ground was white, the air sharp enough to cut skin. We had been sent to hold a ridge above a valley. The enemy had numbers too many. We weren't supposed to make it out." Leo's pulse quickened. He tried to picture it: snow, darkness, soldiers crouched in silence. "They came in waves," she continued. "Men shouting, firing, rushing up the slope. One of ours fell, then another. The radio went dead. I could hear their boots crunching through snow closer and closer. I knew that if they broke through, none of my team would live. Her eyes grew distant, her voice softer but sharper. So I stayed, alone. I told the others to fall back, to regroup at the secondary line. I covered the ridge. Hours passed. The snow around me turned red. Leo swallowed hard. His chest felt tight. But you lived. Her gaze finally returned to his, sharp, unblinking. I lived because I refused not to. I lived because there were names behind me I couldn't allow to vanish. Echo was born that night because when the noise ended, when everything was supposed to be silence, I was still there. The room fell quiet again. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, all too loud now. Leo's throat burned. Why didn't you ever tell me? Evelyn leaned forward, her hand resting lightly over his. Because war isn't something to be proud of, Leo. It's something to endure, to survive, and to put down when you can. My job now isn't to remind the world of what happened. It's to raise you so you don't have to live it. Tears stung his eyes. He blinked them back, nodding. He wanted to hug her, to tell her he was proud. But something about the moment felt sacred, too fragile to break. Later that night, Leo lay awake, her words replaying in his head. The snow turned red. He tried to imagine her there, alone, frozen, holding the line. The same hands that cooked him breakfast, steady around a rifle. The same voice that reminded him to finish his homework, whispering commands in the chaos of battle. It was impossible, and yet it was true. The next day at school, he carried himself differently. Not louder, not prouder, just steadier. He walked with his shoulders square, his gaze level, and people noticed. The whispers followed him still, but they weren't cruel anymore. They were curious, respectful. "Hey, Leo," one of the boys who had mocked him earlier said at lunch, shifting awkwardly. "So, your mom, she's really like that Echo." Leo didn't flinch. He just nodded once, calm, his mother's steadiness echoing in him now. "Yeah, she is." The boy didn't laugh. He didn't dare. He just nodded back slowly and walked away. Leo felt something shift inside him. Respect wasn't demanded. It was earned. And sometimes it was inherited. Meanwhile, Evelyn moved through her days as though nothing had changed. She shopped for groceries. She folded laundry. She read her books. But at night, when Leo had gone to bed, she sometimes slipped into her office, shutting the door quietly behind her. Inside, the walls were lined with fragments of a life no one in town could imagine. Patches, faded photographs, a folded flag, a case that held a medal she never displayed. She ran her fingers along them sometimes, not with pride but with remembrance. On her desk sat an old field journal, its pages filled with quick notes written under fire, coordinates scrawled in darkness, names of men who never came home. She opened it, tracing the letters with her fingertip, her lips moving silently over each one. She never cried. She had spent her tears long ago. But her silence was its own kind of grief. And though she never told Leo about those nights in detail, he felt them in the air. The weight of what she carried, the weight of what she chose not to share. He began to understand something she had never said outright. True strength wasn't the medals, the salutes, the recognition. It was the ability to carry the unbearable and still stand straight. It was the discipline not to need the world's applause. It was dignity. And as he watched her fold the laundry the next evening perfectly, precisely, he realized something else. She had been teaching him this his entire life. Not with stories, not with lectures, with silence, with steadiness. She had been Echo long before he knew what the word meant. What happens when silence becomes louder than every rumor? At Northgate High, the story of the quad hadn't faded. It had grown. The March of 200 SEALs had become legend. Students retold it with wide eyes, each version a little more dramatic than the last. Teachers whispered about it in the lounge. Some embarrassed they had laughed along with Harrison before. Others replayed the salute in their minds like a hymn. But for Leo, the noise outside didn't matter. Something deeper had shifted inside him. He walked through the halls steadier now, not with arrogance, not with pride, with calm, the same calm he had seen in her. His shoulders squared, his eyes steady, his footsteps deliberate. The whispers followed him still, but they no longer pierced him. Some kids gave him wide berth, as though afraid of what he might say. Others looked at him differently, not with pity, not with mockery, but with something closer to respect. One afternoon in history class, Harrison called on him. His voice was quiet now, stripped of its usual bravado. "Leo," he said, "what do you think makes someone a leader?" The room turned toward him. Weeks ago, Leo would have stared down at his desk, words jammed in his throat. But now he breathed steady, lifted his head, and answered. "Someone who doesn't need to say they're in charge," he said. "Someone who doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Someone who's still standing when everything else falls." The room stayed silent, not mocking, not dismissive, silent. Harrison nodded once, almost grateful. "Thank you." Leo lowered his eyes again, but inside, something swelled. He hadn't quoted his mother exactly, but the words were hers all the same. At lunch, he found himself sitting with classmates who had avoided him before. They asked questions, tentative at first. Was your mom really in combat? Did she actually command them? What's she like at home? Leo didn't embellish, he didn't brag, he answered simply calmly, "Yes, she did. She's my mom, she cooks dinner, she tells me to do my homework, she's not different at home." The simplicity unnerved them more than any exaggeration could have, because it meant the extraordinary and the ordinary lived in the same space. Principal Miller noticed too. He began weaving Evelyn's story into subtle lessons, not about glory, but about humility. "Never mistake volume for authority," he told the student body during assembly. "Never mistake quiet for weakness." Teachers began adjusting their tone. Less shouting, less posturing, more listening, more reflection. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't instant, but the culture began to shift. Mr. Harrison, most of all. He walked the halls differently now, not like a man in command, but like a man learning. He didn't bark orders at students anymore. He asked questions. He didn't fill silence with lectures. He let it breathe. One day he stayed after school, erasing the board slowly. Leo lingered in the doorway, backpack slung over his shoulder. Harrison glanced at him, hesitated, then spoke. "You know, your mother was right." Leo tilted his head. "About what?" "About the truth making itself known." Harrison's voice caught rough. "I tried to bury it with noise, tried to make myself feel bigger by making others small, but the truth, it stood right in front of me, and I almost missed it." He set the eraser down, turning fully toward Leo. "I can't undo what I said, I can't erase what I did, but I can learn from it. I hope, someday, that matters." Leo studied him for a moment. His first instinct was to hold on to the anger, the humiliation. But then he remembered his mother's voice. Forgiveness isn't about what someone deserves. It's about whether you carry their actions with you. He didn't forgive him, not yet, but he didn't need to lash out either. "Just teach them right," Leo said quietly. "That'll matter more than an apology to me." Harrison blinked, his throat bobbed, he nodded. "I will." As weeks passed, the story of that day on the quad evolved into something larger. Students who had never cared about history now asked about veterans in their families. A girl in Leo's class discovered her grandfather had served in Korea, something she'd never bothered to ask about. Another boy learned his sister had deployed overseas as a medic. Principal Miller seized the moment. He announced a new tradition. Every November, the school would hold a Veterans Day assembly, not with pageantry, but with stories. Quiet stories. The kind that never made movies. The first guest of honor would be Evelyn Reed. Leo dreaded telling her. He knew she hated the spotlight. When he brought it up at dinner, she didn't even pause while cutting her food. "No," she said simply. "Mom, it's not about recognition. It's—" She set her knife down gently. Her eyes met his. "Leo, my life isn't a story for applause." "But it's not about applause," he pressed. "It's about teaching, about letting people see what strength really looks like. Isn't that what you always say? That silence teaches louder than noise." Her gaze softened just slightly. He was using her words against her, and she knew it. She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "Maybe," she said finally, "but if I do it, I'll do it for you, not for them." That night Leo lay awake again, his mind restless. He imagined her standing on stage, not in a uniform, not with medals, but in her plain sweater and boots. He imagined students leaning forward, listening to a woman who never needed to shout. And he realized something that shook him. Maybe her silence wasn't just armor. Maybe it was a gift. Because in that silence, people leaned in. People paid attention. People remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real echo. Why did the air feel so heavy when she stepped onto the stage? The gym was packed wall to wall. Students filled the bleachers, teachers lined the back, parents pressed into folding chairs. Even the restless energy of teenagers seemed muted, tamped down by the weight of anticipation. Everyone had heard the story. The march, the salute, the nod. But rumor and whispers only went so far. Tonight they expected something more. They expected Evelyn Reed to speak. Leo sat in the front row, his palms damp against his jeans. He had never seen his mother speak to a crowd, never seen her hold attention with words instead of silence. A part of him doubted she would even go through with it. She hated attention, she hated spectacle. And yet here she was, walking across the stage in the same plain sweater, the same practical boots. No uniform, no medals, no signs of rank, just herself. She stood at the podium and looked out over the sea of faces. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her hands rested lightly on the edges of the podium. Her posture was perfect, but her expression unreadable. Then she spoke. "When I was younger, I thought strength meant being louder than everyone else, running farther, pushing harder, proving something. But over time, I learned, real strength is quieter than that." Her voice wasn't amplified by bravado. It was steady, unrushed, each word deliberate as if chosen with care. The microphone carried it to every corner of the gym, but it was her tone that made people lean forward. "Some of you only know me as a mother. Some of you have heard pieces of a story that was never mine to tell. But I want you to know this. Nothing I've done matters more than raising my son. Nothing I endured means more than making sure he never has to endure the same." Leo swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He wanted to look away, but his eyes stayed locked on her. "There are medals for things people see," Evelyn continued. "But there are no medals for the moments that break you. No recognition for the hours spent holding your breath in the dark, wondering if you'll see morning. No applause for carrying names you'll never say aloud again. Those are the burdens soldiers carry, and most of the time they carry them in silence." The gym was silent now too. Even the restless shuffling of students had stilled. "I never wanted my son to carry my story," she said, her voice softer but heavier. "Because it isn't a story, it's a weight. And if I've done my job as his mother, then he will carry his own truth, not mine. And maybe he will carry it differently." Her eyes flickered toward Leo then, just for a heartbeat. The contact pierced him, seared into him. She turned back to the crowd. "You laugh at things you don't understand. You dismiss what doesn't fit your idea of strength. But let me tell you this, strength doesn't look like what you think it does. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be seen. Sometimes strength is just doing the quiet thing that no one else can, and then living with it afterward." The principal shifted on the edge of the stage, his jaw tight. Even Mr. Harrison, tucked in the back, leaned forward, his expression etched with something between shame and awe. Evelyn paused. She let the silence sit. It stretched, uncomfortable at first, then powerful. Then she said one final thing. Dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that, she stepped back. No flourish, no bow, no grand gesture, just a small nod, almost invisible, and she turned from the podium. The gym remained frozen, not even applause at first, just stunned silence. Then slowly hands began to clap, first scattered, then building, then rising into a roar that filled the space, rattled the rafters. But Evelyn didn't return to the podium. She didn't bask in it. She walked calmly off stage, down the steps, and back to the front row where Leo sat. She lowered herself into the seat beside him, folding her hands neatly in her lap as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. Leo's chest was tight, his eyes burning. He didn't know what to say. He just leaned against her shoulder, the simplest gesture he could make. She didn't move. She didn't need to. For the rest of the night, the crowd buzzed with her words. Students whispered them to each other, repeating them like scripture. Teachers exchanged looks, shaken by the simplicity, by the honesty. Even parents in the back row wiped at their eyes. But Evelyn Reed stayed quiet. Because for her, the speech wasn't the point. The point was that she had said it once, and that was enough. At home, later that night, Leo finally broke the silence. "Mom," he whispered as they sat at the kitchen table, "you said dignity doesn't speak, but you spoke tonight." She looked at him, her expression calm. "And what did I say?" Leo thought for a long moment. Then he answered softly, "That silence is strength, that you don't need applause, that the truth speaks for itself." Her lips curved, not a smile, not really, but the closest thing to it. "Then I didn't say much at all." Leo laughed quietly, though his throat was tight. He understood now. Her whole life she had been teaching him without words. Tonight had been no different. She stood, rinsed her cup, and dried it with the same careful precision as always. To anyone else, it would have looked like routine. To Leo, it was the most powerful thing in the world. Because she was Echo, and Echo didn't need to be loud to be remembered. Why do some stories never fade, even when no one speaks them aloud? At Northgate High, the Veterans Day Assembly became legend. Not because of banners or music or flags, not because of speeches from officials or parades of uniforms, but because of one woman in a gray sweater who said less than anyone expected, and yet more than anyone could forget. Her words lingered like an afterimage, burned into memory. Dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Leo felt them everywhere. In the hallways, where laughter had once pierced him like knives but now held no edge. In the classrooms, where whispers followed him not with mockery but with curiosity, sometimes even respect. In the quiet moments at home, where his mother folded towels and wiped counters as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. For him, the change was seismic. He found himself standing straighter, listening deeper, answering when asked but never forcing words. He didn't need to. He had inherited her silence, not the silence of weakness, the silence of strength. His classmates noticed. Some gravitated toward him, asking questions they once would have mocked. Others avoided him, unsettled by the shift. He didn't chase either. He simply walked, steady and grounded. Even Harrison changed. Slowly, awkwardly, painfully. His arrogance had cracked that day on the quad, and the fractured lines had never healed the same. He taught differently now. He no longer filled the room with his voice, but with questions. He no longer glorified loud victories, but spoke of the invisible weight of service, of sacrifice that didn't make headlines. One day, as the semester wound down, he called Leo aside after class. His hands fumbled with the edge of a book, his voice low. "I used to think history was about who shouted the loudest," he admitted. "Kings, generals, speeches, battles. But your mother showed me it's really about who kept going when no one was watching, who stood when everything else fell. That's history too, maybe the truest kind." Leo didn't know what to say. He just nodded. Sometimes silence was the better answer. That night he told his mother. She was at the sink again, rinsing plates with the same calm she carried everywhere. "He said you changed him," Leo murmured, "that you made him see history differently." Evelyn dried the plate, set it down, and turned to face him. I didn't change him. The truth did. I just stopped getting in the way of it. Leo thought about that long after he went to bed. He realized that maybe strength wasn't about forcing others to see you. It was about standing so steadily that, eventually, they had no choice but to notice. Months passed. The quad muster became a story whispered to incoming freshmen. The assembly became an annual tradition, a day not of noise but of reflection. The school began asking students to bring stories of their own families, to listen, not laugh, to pay attention to what had always been there quietly. And Evelyn Reed, she never returned to the stage, she never sought the spotlight again. She didn't need to, once had been enough. One evening, Leo sat across from her at the table, his textbook spread open. He looked up suddenly, catching her folding the cloth she always used for the counters. She aligned the edges perfectly, pressed it flat, and placed it neatly on the counter. "Mom," he asked. "Yes." "You ever regret it, what you had to do?" She paused, her hands resting lightly on the folded cloth. Her eyes lifted to his, calm, steady. "Regret is complicated," she said softly. "There are faces I'll never forget, moments I wish I could erase. But if you're asking whether I regret standing, no, never, because someone had to, and I was still there when the noise ended. That was enough." Leo nodded, his throat tight. He thought about all the times he had wished she were like other mothers, softer, louder, easier to understand. Now he saw that her silence had always been her gift, her way of teaching him that strength wasn't in the shout, but in the stance. Later that night, as he lay awake, he realized something that settled into him like stone. He didn't just want to be her son. He wanted to live the way she did. Steady, quiet, true. And though he didn't know yet what his own path would be, soldier, teacher, something else entirely, he knew one thing: he would carry her lesson with him. Because Echo wasn't just a code name, it was a way of being. At the next year's assembly, Principal Miller stood at the podium. His hair was grayer, his back still straight. He told the new students the story again, of the day the quad fell silent, of the woman in the gray sweater, of the truth that cut deeper than any laugh. And at the end, he said something no one forgot. "You'll hear many voices in life, some loud, some commanding, some demanding to be heard. But remember, when the noise fades, it's the echoes that remain. And if you're lucky, you'll meet someone like Evelyn Reed, someone whose silence teaches more than 1,000 speeches." The gym erupted in applause, but Evelyn, sitting quietly in the back, didn't join in. She simply rested her hands in her lap, calm, composed. She didn't need to be seen. She didn't need to be heard. Because her echo was already everywhere. And Leo, sitting beside her, understood more deeply than ever. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And when the noise fades, that's the only sound left.